Chapter 11, Part 6, about Belle Isle. The place was always swarming with guests. Those in residence every summer were Maurice and his family, and Sarah's faithful three, Georges Clarin, whom she continued to call her dear Georgette, while his name for her was always Dame Jolie. Louisa Bema, who Maurice Rostand says was yearly growing to look more and more like an elderly Japanese admiral, and, of course, Madame Gerard, who was aging rapidly and before too many years was gently to depart this life. Sarah continued to love her petite dame dearly, although the poor soul's blind devotion was at times exasperating. The old lady had a way of urging Sarah to repeat some familiar anecdote, then laughing inordinately, long before the point. Beside those in permanent residence would be a continual coming and going of other visitors, authors, artists, musicians, politicians, and persons who merely had the invaluable asset of being amusing. Sarah, in her impulsive fashion, would occasionally invite someone months in advance to come for a visit, then later regret it. When one August an elderly British spinster, the Honourable Miss Cadogan, sent a wire saying she was arriving the next day, there were cries of pain from the hostess and groans from her immediate entourage. Then she hit on a plan. When the Honourable Miss Cadogan drove up to the fort, Madame Sarah welcomed her in the most effusive manner, then, lowering her voice, informed her that unfortunately at the moment she had staying with her a cousin who was quite mad. An hour later, as they were having tea in the sanatorium, Clarin, impersonating the madman, appeared at an upper window. Maurice, dressed as a male nurse, and old Geoffrey as an attendant, were on either side, and one of them shouted that their patient was about to go into one of his more violent attacks, and they were going to have to put him into a straitjacket. Shortly thereafter, Clarin, having made an escape from his keepers, suddenly rose from behind some tamarisk bushes, leering wildly. The Honourable Miss Cadogan departed the following morning. Occasionally a foreign notable might turn up. There was one memorable day when the British royal yacht anchored off the Point de Plaines, and Madame Sarah's old friend, by then King Edward VII, came across in a launch with a bodyguard of sailors, puffed up the steep steps with the little jetty, and paid the lady of the manor an agreeable visit. Those concrete steps up which His Majesty came panting had been the cause of a local contretemps. Bernhardt had had them constructed to serve as an easy access to a little beach below. When the mayor learned about their going up, he called on Madame Sarah in a state of agitation, and protested that they constituted a menace to the island, if not a threat to France itself. To her astonished "Why?" he answered, "They'll facilitate the landing of the enemy." In still greater astonishment, she demanded to know what enemy, and the little man replied, "Why, the English Navy, of course." Usually in residence for the summer would be some worshipful girl of 19 or 20, a budding actress, painter, or musician, in whom the great lady was interested as a protégée, or, as she put it in her expansive fashion, her adopted daughter. For a year or two a person named Sarita, an actress, served as volunteer secretary, errand runner, and happy slave. It was said that Sarita was the daughter of Jean Bernhardt. The identity of her father seems not to have mattered. She was a strange little thing who tripped restlessly about on high heels, smoked incessantly, and seldom talked. The young woman who became practically a fixture of Sarah's household was Suzanne Saylor, Seylor. A well-born girl from the provinces, she had come to Paris, starry-eyed, to go on the stage, had found a job in the Bernhardt Company, and had stayed on as a permanent member both of that corps and of the actress's home entourage. She lived in the Boulevard Perrier house as well as the Belle Isle manor, accompanied Madame Sarah on tour, taking small roles in some plays, and the rest of the time acting as companion, secretary, courier, and permanent lady-in-waiting. Sir Bernhardt loved the company of young people. It stimulated her to hear of their interests, to share their enthusiasms. At Belle Isle, to watch them running on the tennis court, diving into the clear water, or setting out in a sailboat against a stout wind gave her a wistful pleasure during the years when her torturing knee was forcing her closer and closer to immobility. Two teenage visitors who spent several summers at the Fort de Plains were the Rueff sisters. They came from a Dutch family, prominent in the musical and artistic circles of London, and their parents were close friends of Madame Sarah. Suze has left us some happy glimpses of the actress's rural routine, as has Yvonne Longo, another young visitor at the time. Usually, Madame Sarah rose at 6 and, gun over her shoulder, went out onto the promontory to shoot ducks, or, failing any game birds, she'd bring down a seagull just for the hell of it, which does seem rather deplorable sportsmanship. One author wrote of arriving for a visit via the early morning boat from Quiberon. Approaching the fort past a formidable guard of two immense ceramic pelicans, and crossing the drawbridge just as the chatelaine of the keep emerged dressed in fisherman's jacket and pants, a white beret on her tousled hair, her bare feet in coarse espadrilles. She was armed with a shotgun, accompanied by two colossal mastiffs and a tiny boy. By the way of a greeting, she fired the gun into the air. A seagull fell, and the little boy retrieved it. Mornings were spent in whatever pursuit each guest fancied. The artists painted, the writers wrote, the musicians practiced, the sports-minded sailed, swam, or rode shaggy little ponies about the wind-swept island. Sarah herself might work on some project in her studio or take a bath in seaweed, which was thought to be highly salubrious. Or perhaps, accompanied by a number of dogs, she'd go for a walk along the path that led through the Cyclopean rocks, out onto the high promontory overlooking the sea, always using a stout cane on which she became more and more dependent. Eventually, she had iron handrails installed along the steep stretches, and at one point a resting place carved out of the rock. This became known as Sarah Bernhardt's armchair, and is still a visiting site for island tourists. Often she would organize a shrimping expedition. Net in hand, wearing a great flopping hat anchored by a flowing white veil, her skirts looped up above her knees, she'd wade out into the chilly water and often return with a good haul for lunch. Her menus were delicious and as carefully planned as those in her Paris house. Attractively served on gay Brittany plates, the food was mainly local produce, much of it from her own estate. For she had purchased the neighboring farm of Penhoet, which provided her with eggs, milk, chicken, and butter, although occasionally she'd take it into her head to make her own butter, or, to be more precise, persuade a compliant guest or two to work the churn to the point of exhaustion. She grew her own potatoes and fresh vegetables, also a fair supply of wheat, oats, and barley to be ground at a local mill. She owned a few sheep. There was also a small herd of cattle, which she thought it picturesque to have pastured in a nearby field, until the guests looked out one day to behold Louise Abema, who, wearing a red jacket, had strolled into the enclosure, was barely making it to the opposite fence ahead of an onrushing bull. The most significant of all French repasts, the midday meal, would be served promptly at 1. Once in a while there would be a picnic by the shore or under trees in a meadow. There were no torturous occasions when sitting on the ground one consumed dry sandwiches, gray hard-boiled eggs, sand, and small insect life. At a Bernhardt picnic, that was P-I-Q-U-E-N-I-Q-U-E, picnic, wooden tables and chairs would have been set up, plates, cutlery, and wine glasses laid out, and the food, piping hot, would be brought out by farm wagon at exactly the proper hour. Every lunch, whether indoors or al fresco, would automatically be followed by the mass siesta in the sanatorium. When she'd done with her hour of murmuring to the world at large that she was sleeping, She'd come out from her doze with the bound of a fireman at the first sound of the alarm and order everyone to the tennis court. Sarah Bernhardt's tennis game had its own rules, and they were hardly those of the International Tennis Association. It was an unwritten law that her side had to win. When it came to any game, for that matter, she had to be the winner or else go into the sulking of a neurotically spoiled child. She was a bad loser, and the first to admit that she frequently cheated at cards. But, she'd say, flashing that electrifying smile, since I'm frank about cheating, it can't be real cheating, can it? In tennis, she always played doubles, taking a stand whenever possible close to the net. Any return balls had to be placed well within her reach, otherwise she'd throw down her racket and walk off the court. Although more and more hindered by her knee, her enthusiasm remained unmodified. Even up to a few years before her amputation, she'd have herself wheeled to the tennis court and, barely able to totter, take her stand at the net. The opposing players always saw to it that Madame Sarah won her set. Evenings at Belle Isle were simple and relaxed. One played cards or dominoes. Sometimes there were charades, often childish games, and always good talk. Occasionally a singer or pianist might feel inclined to perform, or a poet to read aloud his latest verses. Reynaldo Hahn, who as a young man was a frequent guest at Belle Isle, tells of one evening when Sarah jumped up, pushed him off the piano stool, and asked if he'd care to hear her one musical composition. This was a terrible little piece called The Dance of the Bears, which she'd made up to amuse Maurice when he was a child. You see, she said with pride, the left hand doesn't move at all. It just keeps on repeating the same notes. Hahn remembers another evening when he happened to start playing and humming the habanera from Carmen. Maurice seized his mother's scarf and went into a Spanish dance, his two small daughters imitating him. Clarin grabbed up a fat lady guest and whirled her madly about the room, while old Geoffrey wheezed about in a wild fandango. It ended up with everyone going into convulsions of laughter. We hold our sides, we moan. Sarah, her head in her hands, weeps with laughter, hiccups, sobs. She gasps and lies back, her eyes close, palms down, then is once more doubled up with glee. Sometimes when the tide was right, they would all go down to the shore to watch the fishermen haul in their nets filled with a glimmering, slithering haul. On moonlight nights, when she was tranquil, Sarah would spend a full hour out on the rocky point, drinking in the soft air, the view, and the immense peace. Yvonne Lanko says that her friends kept silent, and she, dressed in white, made one think of a druid priestess listening to the waves. 2 more pages. While all this relaxation, the Bernhardt compulsion for work did not slacken. She was continually reading new plays or going over old ones. Maurice Baring, who paid her a visit in 1901, reports that at the time she was studying a Shakespearean role in English and that he's not sure that it wasn't Romeo. Maybe he was afraid to find out. At times, she'd concentrate on her sculpture. One year, she modeled some Art Nouveau ornaments shaped like flowers and small beasts. They were subsequently cast in metal and exhibited at the 1900 Paris Exposition. It is said that Lalique copied some of those for his jewelry. She made a model for a small paperweight in the form of a fish, had it copied in gold with the eyes of opal, and gave it to Rostand. Even after she was confined to a wheelchair, she had to find outlet for her energies and started modeling 4 statues intended to be likenesses of Maurice, his wife, Simone, and Liziane, which she wanted placed about her tomb. That mournful resting place she designated to be out on a favorite promontory. The request, as is known, was not carried out, and Sarah Bernhardt today lies in Père Lachaise. The island folk adored this woman. They called her La Bonne Dame, and with reason. Whenever she drove through the small village, they came out in droves to greet her. She was always laden with cakes and preserves to distribute among the inhabitants, and large bags full of hard candies for the children. She chatted with the farmers and fishermen, inquired after their welfare, and her concern was genuine. She had only to hear of a ship's master whose cargo had been ruined in a storm, or a fisherman who'd lost his nets or his lobster pots, and she'd dive into her purse to help him out, and she paid visits of condolence to every family who might have lost a man at sea. The mayor of the little town was also the local priest, and great would be his astonishment on those rare occasions when La Bonne Dame showed up for Mass. Bernhardt was an enthusiastic but careless Catholic, but she loved the simplicity of the little village church and spoke often of being moved during the pardon services by the sight of the bowed heads of the young Breton girls and their vulnerable necks below the white native bonnets all rising and falling in rhythm. After service, the congregation would crowd about her carriage. Yvonne Lanko tells of one small boy who was lifted up onto his father's shoulder to see the great lady. The child stared at the strange personage, who by then was well advanced in years, at her yards of white veiling which protected the made-up face from the sun, and piped out, "Is that Madame Sarah Bernhardt? Why is she ugly?" Sarah burst out laughing and pressing a gold piece into the child's grubby little hand, said, "That's for telling me the truth." Even in Paris, the Belle Islanders were in her thoughts. The winter of 1911 was a cruel one, with bitter cold and innumerable storms disastrous to the fishing fleet. She organized a large benefit performance, pressing the leading stars of the theater to take part, and cleared a vast sum which she sent to the local syndicate for distribution among the needy. Tourists were frequently coming over to the island. They would gather on a certain hill that commanded a good view of the Bernhardt property and stare through field and opera glasses, hoping to catch a glimpse of the great actress. Sometimes an obliging lady guest would manage to disperse them by putting on her hostess's hat, swathing herself in white scarves, and waving briefly from an upper window, and the group would go away satisfied. Some 500 meters across from the fort was a large manor house belonging to a local baron. Shortly before the First World War, the baron died, and a promoter took it over to turn into a 20-room hotel. Horrified at the prospect of a stream of summer vacationers cluttering up the primitive little island, Sarah purchased the building from the owner, a move doubtless counted on by the man to begin with, and turned it into a further residence. She also bought up all the land within view to protect the property, sinking in all but 4 million francs into this Brittany establishment. Then, in 1922, obeying one of her quick decisions, she sold the whole place without a quaver of sentimental regret. Even at 78, this indomitable woman never looked backward.